It's a great honor to be among such brave and courageous people. As I listened to all these talks today, I realized that the hope for the vast majority of people who are oppressed is that their leadership, the bad leadership that are oppressing them, will somehow be overthrown, disappear, or whatever. And in some cases that happens. It happened in Zimbabwe. In some cases it carries on like it has in Russia, in Iran, and various other places. For the people who have to be subjected to dictatorship and oppression, and they can't do anything about it, we've actually found a medium-term solution, which is known as the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation which came as a result of a terrible tragedy that befell my lawyer, Sergey Magnitsky, in Russia. Very briefly, I will tell you the story and then tell you what the Magnitsky Act does and why it's so powerful. I was the largest foreign investor in Russia. I uncovered corruption in Russian companies, and I exposed that corruption in my business. And in doing so, I enraged Vladimir Putin, who was a beneficiary of that corruption. And in November of 2005, I was expelled from the country, declared a threat to national security. 18 months later, my offices were raided in Moscow by 25 police officers who took away a bunch of documents. The documents were then used to fraudulently steal our investment holding companies. I hired a young lawyer named Sergey Magnitsky to investigate. Sergey Magnitsky investigated and discovered that the theft of our companies was done in order to steal $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government. Sergey and I were both convinced that the authorities might have been authorized to steal my money, but they weren't authorized to steal their own money, the Russian government's money. And we thought that if Putin and the senior officials in the Russian government were to understand what had happened, then the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. We ended up filing criminal complaints with every different law enforcement agency in Russia. I went to the media, and Sergey gave sworn statements to the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is their version of the FBI. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out in Putin's Russia, and I make a distinction between Russia and Putin's Russia for Vladimir here. In Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. And instead of arresting the people who stole the $230 million, the same people who Sergey Magnitsky testified against came to his home at 8 in the morning on the 24th of November 2008, arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, and began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow. He nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt officers and to sign a false confession to say he stole the $230 million, and did so on my instruction. Sergey Magnitsky refused to do that. His conditions got only worse and worse. He ended up getting very sick. He got terrible pains in his stomach. He then ended up losing 20 kilos. He was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation on the 1st of August 2009. A week before that operation, they came to him again and asked him again to sign a false confession. Again, he refused. They abruptly moved him to a different prison facility that had no medical wing at all. At his new prison, his health went into a complete downward spiral. He and his lawyers wrote desperate requests to every different branch of the criminal justice system in Russia, asking for medical attention, begging for medical attention. And all of his requests were either ignored or denied in writing. On the night of November 16, 2009, Sergey Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the authorities at the prison with no medical wing decided they didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore, and so they sent him to a different prison facility that had a medical wing. But when he arrived there by ambulance, Instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him to death that night, November 16th, 2009, 8.5 years ago. I've made it my life's mission since then to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky. We tried initially to get justice inside of Russia. This was a well-documented case. Sergei Magnitsky very unusually wrote everything down about what happened to him during his time in prison in the form of 450 criminal complaints against the regime that he filed during his 358 days in detention. And we were certain, because of this incredible amount of evidence that we had and testimony, that they would have to prosecute the people who killed him. But instead, the Putin regime circled the wagons. They exonerated everybody who was involved. They gave special honors and promotions to some of the people who were most complicit. And in the most shocking miscarriage of justice, 3 years after they killed Sergei Magnitsky, they put him on trial in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia, and put me on trial as his co-conspirator, found us both guilty. They couldn't do anything more to him than killing him. They sentenced me to 9 years in absentia. So it became obvious that we couldn't get justice inside of Russia, so we said, let's get justice outside of Russia. Well, how do we get justice outside of Russia for a crime that was committed in Russia? Well, this is the problem that everybody in this room faces, is that if a regime is corrupt and dictatorial and oppressive, there's no way to get justice in that country, and outside of the country, there's no mechanisms for justice. And so I looked at this particular situation, and I said that this was a crime committed for $230 million by the people who stole $230 million to cover up their theft. And they don't keep that money in Russia, they keep it in the West, as do most other dictators. And so we came up with the idea of freezing their assets and banning their visas. I took this idea to Washington in 2010, and I sat down with Benjamin Cardin, a Democratic senator from Maryland, and John McCain, a Republican from Arizona. I told them the story I've just shared with you, and I said, can we ban the visas and freeze the assets of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And they said yes, and they came up with the Sergey Magnitsky Act in 2010. And the moment after they launched it, other victims started coming forward and saying, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. This is what they care about. Can you ban the people who killed my brother, my father, my sister, my uncle? And they realized after about a dozen of these calls that they were onto something much bigger than just one case, much bigger than Sergei Magnitsky. And so they added 65 words to the law to go after all human rights abusers in Russia. And then people from other countries started coming around and saying, in fact, one of my colleagues here who will speak in a moment said, well, why not China? Why not Iran? Why not Venezuela? And so in 2012, the Magnitsky Act passed 92-4 in the Senate, 89% of the House of Representatives. It became law on December 14th. And because of these other conversations, in December 2016, the global Magnitsky Act was passed by the US Senate, which sanctions bad guys everywhere in the world. And I'm proud to say on that same day, Estonia passed their own version of a global Magnitsky Act. And then in May of this last year, the British government passed the Magnitsky Amendment to the Criminal Finances Bill, which allows the UK government to seize the assets of human rights violators in the UK. And then in October of last year, the Canadian government passed the Canadian Magnitsky Act, of which Vladimir was an integral part of making happen. And then in November of last year, on the 8th anniversary of Sergei Magnitsky's murder, the Lithuanian government passed the Magnitsky Act. And then 2 weeks ago, the Latvian government passed the Magnitsky Act. We now have 6 countries that have global Magnitsky Acts. There are 2 more on deck, Ukraine and South Africa. And we're now trying to get France, Sweden, and the Netherlands on board. And my hope is that this becomes a standard tool for fighting impunity in the world. It used to be that atrocities like in Cambodia with Khmer Rouge, these guys didn't go on vacation to Saint-Tropez. But these days, the Russians and the Uzbeks and the Venezuelans and even the Zimbabweans do. And we now have a tool to really do something to them that everybody seems to care about. And so I'm hoping that, that this piece of legislation becomes a standard that everybody in this room and everybody in the room tomorrow will be able to call on their governments, their Western governments, to use it, and it will send the chills down the spines of dictators and totalitarian despots who are ruining the lives of their populations. Thank you very much.